There was a period in the early part of the 19th century where France, under Napoleon's leadership, controlled almost all of continental Europe. Only a few countries tried to maintain a position of neutrality, and that was not easy to do. In 1801, Britain attacked neutral Denmark in the name of preventing the Danish-Norwegian fleet from falling into the hands of Napoleon, but they didn't sink the fleet at that time. In 1807, with France ascendant and Napoleon demanding that neutral nations choose a side, Britain was concerned that Denmark would side with Napoleon, and so for the second time in 6 years prepared a fleet to strike preemptively. And this time it would be the citizens of Copenhagen who would suffer the consequences. It is history that deserves to be remembered. At the outset of the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark and Norway were part of a combined monarchy often called the Twin Realms, which also included Iceland and Greenland. Small and without an impressive army, Denmark had taken a neutral approach to wars for decades and made significant money by the policy during, for instance, the American Revolution. Napoleon, however, presented a very different threat. In 1801, Britain had attacked Denmark in an effort to prevent her from joining her fleet with Russia's in a coalition of neutral shipping, which Britain considered a kind of alliance with France. Britain could not allow Denmark to close off the Baltic Sea and British ally Sweden, where Britain received a large amount of raw materials and trade goods. The 1801 attack succeeded in defeating the Danish fleet at Copenhagen and forced the Danes to give up parts of its policy of armed neutrality. On the continent, France dominated, defeating the Russians and Austrians at Austerlitz in 1805 and the Prussians at Jena in 1806. Russia would be knocked out of the war at Friedland in 1807. While the British defeated the French at Trafalgar, Napoleon was the uncontested victor in mainland Europe. In retaliation for the British blockade, he proclaimed his continental system, which forbade the import of British goods at French allied or dependent countries. The Treaty of Tilsit between the French and the Russians raised tensions in the United Kingdom to a fever pitch. The only holes in Napoleon's control of the continent were Portugal, Denmark, and Sweden. Denmark was under significant pressure to pledge their fleet to Napoleon, and to go along with the continental system or face reprisal from Napoleon. Frederick VI, crowned Prince of Denmark-Norway, had already positioned most of his army in the south in the Duchy of Holstein, out of fear of a possible attack from the French. Rumors from the continent convinced the British government that the French planned on invading Denmark, and even that the Danes had secretly agreed to oppose Britain. Swedish King Gustavus IV was claiming that the Danes would land troops in Sweden in support of a French invasion. Denmark was in a difficult position. Despite the 1801 battle, the kingdom still had a considerable navy, although it was mostly mothballed. On July 14, 1806, Lord Mulgrave was given permission to send a naval force to survey the Danish fleet and engage in prompt and vigorous operations at his discretion. 4 days later, the cabinet sent diplomat Francis Jackson to convince the Danes to give their navy to the British, while simultaneously issuing an order for more than 50 ships to sail for particular service under Admiral James Gambier. News continued coming from the continent that worried Britain. On the night of July 21st, intelligence arrived that Napoleon was attempting to get Russia to form a maritime league with Denmark and Portugal to oppose Britain. Chancellor of the Exchequer Spencer Perceval wrote a memorandum summarizing the case for sailing to Copenhagen. The intelligence from so many and such various sources of French pressure on Denmark could not be doubted. Nay, the fact that Napoleon has openly avowed such intention in an interview with the Emperor of Russia is brought to this country in such a way as it cannot be doubted. Under such circumstances, it would be madness. It would be idiotic to wait for an overt act. Of course, the UK did have some reason to fear what France would do. On August 6, 1807, an ultimatum was given to the Danish envoy in Paris. Join the blockade, go to war with Britain, or face a French invasion. When George Canning became Foreign Secretary on March 25, 1807, he harbored deep suspicion of Danish plans. The situation threatened to ignite thanks to a packet service, which carried mail from Britain onto the continent and back, including reports from British agents. The French demanded that the Danes close the port to British ships, but the Danes didn't want to antagonize either power. The Danes reported this to the British, claiming they didn't want to close the port but might be forced to. Canning seems to have thought the reports evidence of Danish duplicity. Danish and British relations were also strained thanks to British seizure of Danish ships, including 2 that had been en route to pay the Barbary pirates for safe passage of Danish ships. It didn't help that the Danes were selling false papers and concealing prohibited cargoes on their ships. In June 1807, the British received a report that at least 20 Danish ships of the line were fit to go out to sea with all their stores. These ships were likely mothballed, but had supplies on hand if necessary. According to Danish records, only 3 ships of the line, 2 frigates and 3 brigs, were actually outfitted for sail. Canning saw this as a preparation for war, although other British reports said that there's not at present the shadow of appearance for the equipment of the fleet. The Danes had improved harbor defenses since 1801, so the British planned on sending a ground army in addition to the fleet. 10,000 men of the German Legion were available, stationed nearby in Swedish Pomerania, as were 16,000 troops that had been prepared to land as a distraction to support Russia before Friedland. Diplomat Jackson had a plan to allow the Danes to sell the fleet to the British, even allowing the transaction to appear forced to prevent French retaliation. The British offer was really a demand: surrender the fleet to the British or face an attack. The Danes would have about a week to answer, or the attack would commence. Despite ample evidence, the Danes were largely oblivious, or perhaps in denial, about the attack. The Danish envoy in London resisted the rumors that the fleet was aimed at Copenhagen, and no preparations were made for defense. On August 7th, the Crown Prince sent a letter to Danish defenders that ended with, "We are not at war with England, and do not expect to be." Jackson's meeting with the Crown Prince on August 8th failed to impress the Crown Prince with the peril of his situation. He suggested that Jackson correct Britain's misinformation and asked for new instructions. On August 9th, orders were sent to Copenhagen to prepare defenses. Jackson told the Danes that the attack would begin on August 14th and could not end with less than the delivery of the Danish fleet. The Crown Prince ordered preparations at Copenhagen and on the island of Zealand, and then fled the city with his aged father. The Danish crown jewels were hidden in a coffin at an abbey, and the whole government vacated Copenhagen. Copenhagen had for defense about 5,500 regular troops and another 2,500 landværen made up of retired soldiers and a larger number of poorly equipped militia. The harbor had significant artillery defense with hundreds of guns and multiple batteries. They also had the 64-gun Mars, along with St. Thomas with 20 guns and 3 smaller 16-gun ships. Preparations were made to scuttle the mothballed fleet rather than let it fall to the British. By August 25th, the British fleet consisted of 25 ships of the line, 71 smaller vessels, and nearly 30,000 soldiers. An appeal was printed in Sweden, which explained to the Danes that they had to act to prevent Napoleon from seizing the fleet, that the fleet would be returned eventually, and that the soldiers would respect the Danes as long as they weren't attacked. It was framed not as an attack, but as an act of self-defense, unless the Danes resisted. Troops began to land on the 16th, unopposed, and the Crown Prince formally declared war on Britain. Skirmishing began on the 17th, when a Danish force sortied out of the city and Danish gunboats captured a British merchantman. The British were able to stop 2 caravans of cannon and gunpowder from reaching the city, along with a huge number of firearms meant to arm the militia. In the following days, the Danes attempted multiple sorties, one with 2,000 men on the 20th that failed to destroy a British battery. On the 21st, Lieutenant General Cathcart, in charge of the army, determined that the landward defenses were too great for his army to overcome and sent a letter bemoaning his lack of siege equipment to Admiral Gambier of the Navy. Gambier merely suggested that the Navy could take over the operation and that they would likely soon succeed. Cathcart, challenged and chagrined, pressed forward, driving the Danish skirmish lines back into the city and capturing the suburbs. According to a witness, Danish defenses were poor, and the Danish men were very soon driven under the walls by our riflemen only. The defenders did attempt a major sortie from all 3 city gates, but failed to drive the British back. The British prepared siege batteries, but the situation was not without danger. Cathcart knew that he had to force Copenhagen to surrender or destroy the sitting fleet before French or Danish forces arrived to relieve the city, and targeting the fleet with any accuracy was impossible. The British fleet would have to retire by November because of the weather. One plan submitted to Cathcart included the further step, however. If it is found that the destruction of the fleet is actually not within the power of our mortar batteries, we must then on necessity resort to the harsh measure of forcing the town into our terms by the sufferings of the inhabitants themselves. Cathcart decided that this was the only way to finish the siege quickly. The decision was significant, an indiscriminate bombardment of the town that risked civilian casualties, and it was never ordered or approved by the British government. Cathcart does seem to have agonized over the choice, with diplomat Jackson writing that Cathcart was overly worried over the horror of knocking down the houses and the chance of a shell falling upon a girls' boarding school. Cathcart nevertheless committed to the attack and even planned to storm the city if the bombardment failed. As Cathcart prepared his attack, the Danes repeatedly attempted operations to relieve the siege without success. Sorties of firemen burned down buildings that were obstructing the defenders' view, and repeated attacks by the small Danish gunboats brought some success. One witness complained that these confounded boats are so small that we may fire all day without being able to touch them, while they hit us every time. In one sortie, General Payman, in charge of the defense, had a musket ball go clean through his leg. The Crown Prince didn't dare move his army, afraid that they would be intercepted attempting to cross to Zealand, or that the French would invade behind him in support. Most dangerous to the British siege was the arrival of nearly 7,000 landwehren and militia threatening their rear, but the British reserves met them at Kjog on August 29th. The Danish force broke quickly, facing the British regulars, turning into a complete rout. The landwehren apparently abandoned their military clogs in such numbers that they dubbed it the Battle of the Clogs. This battle, led by Arthur Wellesley, was the future Duke of Wellington's first victory in Europe. On August 31st, the British batteries, armed with 8 howitzers, 36 guns, 44 mortars, and Congreve rockets, were ready. Cathcart demanded surrender once again, but was refused. On September 2nd, at 7:30 p.m., the British began the bombardment. The rockets, while not terribly accurate, were terrifying. Payman called them uncivilized. 12 hours of bombardment caused significant damage in the northern part of the city, where old medieval houses had caught fire. One Danish historian reported 38 major fires started during the attack. The British deliberately fired at the largest fires, killing firefighters and hampering efforts to extinguish the flames. The bombardment was confined to the night, and the bombardment of the 4th was particularly devastating. With firefighters exhausted and lacking equipment, the flames took hold. There were reports that militia abandoned their post to save their families. The tallest spire in the city, that of the Church of Our Lady, came crashing down just before dawn. The fire from our batteries, one British soldier wrote, and from the Danish ramparts, resembled a constant succession of flashes of lightning, and the very firmament shook with the unceasing explosions. Some of the flames in the Church of Our Lady were apparently not fully extinguished until the end of the month, and as many as 2,000 people were reported dead in the September 4th bombardment. The British were prepared to storm the city, but Payman had had enough. He requested a 24-hour armistice to prepare for surrender, but Cathcart pressed him, thinking the armistice only a delaying tactic. Payman gathered the leaders of the city and told them that the city could not hold. They voted unanimously to capitulate. Cathcart asked only for the surrender of the fleet, and not for anything else that might embarrass the Danes more than necessary. They signed the articles on September 7th, guaranteeing that the British would abandon the island within 6 weeks with the Danish fleet. No payment or promise of return was included. Within a few weeks, Britain had prepared 16 ships of the line, 11 frigates, 12 lesser vessels, and 26 gunboats for return to England. Denmark signed an official alliance with France, and that would take them into wars with England and Sweden for years to come. Russia also declared war as a result, but Russia and England would be allies again within just 5 years. And in the end, England suffered little for the attack, but Denmark suffered a significant economic downturn, and it took decades to repair the damage in Copenhagen. Crown Prince Frederick was furious with Payman and sentenced him to death for not burning the ships, although he eventually commuted the sentence. The British did express some remorse for the bombardment. George III called it a very immoral act, and the cabinet decided not to try to reoccupy Zealand, to preserve our character of good faith intact. The event largely speaks to Britain's concerns about Napoleon, who at that point had nearly completed his European empire. But most embarrassing was that Britain found out that the Danes were not, as they had suspected, preparing their ships to sail. Cathcart essentially found them mothballed, writing that few of the ships are of any considerable progress of equipment and that it would take some time to complete them for sea. Of course, that part of Cathcart's report was left out of the British newspapers. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.